So let's get started now with our discussion for the next unit test, the third of 4 unit tests. So this one from our new text is going to be chapters, I changed the numbers, so let me make sure I get the right ones. 9, 10, 11, and 12. Chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. And I'd have it loaded on the app right away. But basically what happens is chapter 9 is on stratification just in general, social stratification. Chapter 10 is on global stratification. Chapter 11 is on gender stratification. And then chapter 12 is on race and ethnicity. So stratification by race and ethnicity. So in terms of format, there's matching sections, groups of 10 from each chapter, and all of the 10 things that are in the matching are exactly the terms that are in the note card review thing at the end of the app. So as we were talking about today, we watched those videos and I had you say what the video is related to and the terms for chapter 12. It had assimilation, prejudice, discrimination, institutional prejudice, race, ethnicity. So there's exactly 10 terms per chapter, and it's exactly the ones that are on those review pages. So that's the matching section. Then there's a bunch of multiple choice questions that are kind of application. So it'll tell you a scenario. It's like, Johnny does this, what theory does that relate to? And then you have to identify which one. And then at the end, there's a section like we've had in the other tests where it'll give you a quote, and you have to identify which of the main theories in sociology relate to that quote. So there's 40 matching exactly. It's not exactly 40, or 50, I should say. It's not exactly 50, but it's like 45, 50, I forget the exact number, multiple choice, and then the last 15 or so are the identification ones. The identification ones, I try to make there be about a quarter on just stratification in general, a quarter on global strat, a quarter on gender, and so on. Same thing with the multiple choice questions, the application questions. I try to give you about a quarter on each thing. So, I want to spend most of my time today talking about scenarios and asking you questions about application rather than just sheer definitions, because I think those are the straightforward ones, correct? Mm-hmm. So I'll do some of that, but again, most of what I want to do involves the other things. So give me a second, let me open this up so I don't forget to discuss something. So first of all, when we're talking about stratification just in general, what is stratification? Yes, so stratification just in general is the pattern or system by which society categorizes people, and that categorization of people includes hierarchy and a power dynamic, and some assumptions about values as well. So the term hierarchy means ordered structure where people above have more power, are viewed as more important or more influential than people below. So that's stratification in general. Remember, Marx is one of the guys that talked about stratification a lot with conflict theory. The other guy that talked about stratification was Max Weber. Looks like Max Weber, but it's German, so the W is pronounced as a V. What was the term he used to talk about stratification? It can be abbreviated SES.
Oh, socioeconomic status.
Socioeconomic status. So that involves power, what he called status, so that'd be kind of prestige, and then money. Those are the 3 variables that Weber thought. So there's something that's described as status consistency. Status consistency is where somebody has like high power, high prestige, and high money all at once. So let me give you some examples of some professions, and then I want you to identify if that person would have high status consistency or low status consistency. So let's say like a college professor that teaches elementary education. If you go to college, you take a class from a teacher that tells you how to teach elementary kids. So they've got a lot of degrees, right? And college professor, remember that rating scale we had about prestige scores? So college professor is pretty high, but how much do elementary ed professors make?
Not a lot.
Not that much. No, not that much. So would they have high status consistency or low?
Low.
They'd have low status consistency because those variables that Weber talked about, prestige, power, and money, those don't match up. What about, let's say, a computer programmer in a business? Just has a bachelor's degree, computer programmer, what would that person have? Do you remember what the prestige score was for computer programmers? It was higher, but, so the salary, I would say to a degree, computer programmers would have lower status consistency as well, because they make a lot of money, but it's like, oh, you're a computer programmer. It's not as prestigious as some other jobs. And you don't have to have a lot of, you don't necessarily have a lot of power, and you don't have to have a lot of degrees with it as well. So the point that the concept of status consistency brings up is the fact that power and stratification are about more than money, right? So there's a couple questions where it'll give you a scenario and it says like, John is a banker, he does this. What is true about status consistency with him? And you have to identify. So be able to apply those ideas of status consistency.
So it's more than money and
It's more than money and wealth, yep. Status also includes prestige, and it also includes power. The extreme example, I like to give extreme examples to kind of prove a point, hyperbole. So the example I often use, I don't remember if I used it this year, was, let's say you bring home, you go to school at UNLV, it's in Las Vegas, and then you tell your parents, yeah, I'm gonna bring home this girlfriend that I've met, and then she makes a ton of money, and then she walks in the door and her parents are like, oh, she's cute, seems really nice, you know, what do you do? And she's like, I'm the most well-known stripper in Vegas. So, makes a ton of money, but your mom or your grandma might pass out. You imagine like you walk in for Thanksgiving, and then you, oh yeah, this is Bunny, or whatever her stage is, right? So, like your parents would not be happy, because that's a very low prestige job. It's viewed as like demeaning, correct? So, status consistency, that concept proves that it's not just money, it's other things as well. Now, in social class systems, there's 3 different types historically that have, what are those social class systems called? Meritocracy, caste, and just called class. Good.
Class.
So in meritocracy, what determines position?
Your effort.
Effort or skills or talent or worth. So the term they would use for that is achieved status. Remember how we talked about achieved versus ascribed status? Achieved is a status that you take on, voluntarily you work for. Ascribed is a status you have just because of how you were born. So in meritocracies, the idea is that the people that rise to the top should be smarter, more valuable to society, harder working. There should be some reason as to why they're higher. In a caste system, it's based on ascription. So ascription is a status you're born with. And then class systems are a combination of the two. And as I mentioned in class, I would argue there's never been a pure caste system or there's never been a pure meritocracy. Because if you, in a meritocracy, you can't have anything other than merit determine where somebody's at. And that's really hard to pull off. Same thing in a caste system. Like, there's always going to be somebody that works a little harder or is more organized or something. And that makes them a little bit better. It's very hard to control. So, historically, what's the classic example of a caste system?
Wasn't it over India?
India, yep. The Indian caste system where they had 5 traditional levels. At the top, you had the Brahmins, the priestly caste. You don't need to know that term. Second level, you had the Kshatriyas, the rulers and warriors. At the bottom, they had what were called untouchables. So we do talk about untouchables a little bit. That's in the text. So if your parents were untouchables, that's what you were also. And they had laws like you couldn't marry, if you were untouchable, you couldn't marry somebody in a different caste. If they treated you really bad, all that stuff. So caste, class, and meritocracy. Communist systems tried to do what? What were they trying to do?
They were trying to make
They were trying to flatten stratification. They didn't want different levels. They wanted everybody treated the same. What is it called if individuals move up a class or down a class?
Social mobility.
Social mobility. So if you yourself, your parents are poor, you start out you're poor, you go to college, become like a very good physician, end up specializing in all that stuff, make a bunch of money. What type of social mobility is that? That's called intra-generational. The prefix intra means within. If your parents start out poor, they work hard, end up rich, and then from their generation, now you're rich because you're born to them, that's called intergenerational social mobility.
So what was
Intra is just you. Inter is your parents start out poor, become wealthy, and social mobility also counts downward as well. So your parents could have been rich and then did a bunch of stupid stuff, and then they're poor, and now you're born poor, right? So in that instance, that would be also intergenerational. But if you start out rich because of your parents' situation, make a bunch of bad decisions, end up losing all your money, whatever, that's intra-generational. So the concept of social mobility, again, is the process by which people move amongst different levels of society. Okay, let's talk about a functional analysis of inequality or stratification. Remember how we've discussed sub-theories quite a bit? So in global stratification in a little bit, I'll talk about modernization and dependency theory. Right now, when it comes to stratification in general, what's the sub-theory that relates to functionalism called? It's named after two people. Yeah, keep going. The Davis-Moore thesis. Yeah. And the idea with the Davis-Moore thesis is that society needs to attract individuals to jobs that help society function more. So they attach rewards to those jobs in the form of higher pay, more prestige, whatever, that will draw talented people into those positions. So we make brain surgeons go to school for, man, with your residency and everything, I bet brain surgeons go to school for like 12 years probably, post-high school. So the reason we do that is because if I get brain cancer or you get brain cancer or whatever, we want people that are disciplined, super hardworking, and smart to go into those positions. Because, that's kind of an important thing. Whereas like somebody that goes to school to be a stylist, cut hair, if I get a bad haircut, it's not the end of the world. I mean, you've seen me in class all year. It's not the end of the world, right?
Yeah.
If my haircut's not the best, it's not the end of the world. I'm not dead. You go to a bad brain surgeon, bad stuff happens. So the Davis-Moore thesis, as you mentioned, says that society has to attach greater rewards to positions that are needed for society to function. So if you have an egalitarian society, take communism to its logical conclusion. In a communist system, everybody's supposed to basically get the same, right?
Yep.
You're not rewarded from the fruits of your labor. You're a grad student in school, suffering while your friends are out, chasing chicks or whatever. You're like, why should I study? This stinks. It destroys motivation. Okay, and we talked about Marxist theory a little bit already. I'm going to give you some examples of jobs, and I want you to tell me what type of occupation those jobs are. So white collar, blue collar, pink collar. Okay? Let's say welder. Blue collar. Let's say linesman, like somebody that climbs up power lines and fixes those. Blue collar. Let's say kindergarten teacher. Pink collar. Pink collar. Dental hygienist. Pink collar. Let's say financial advisor. White collar. Let's say plumber.
Blue.
So now, talk to the person next to you real quick. What's the difference between those three? White, blue, and pink.
Blue's labor is like an office job, high ranking position.
Yep,
That's it.
I'll define them all now.
Okay.
So let's define them. White collar. White collar are jobs that traditionally are done in some type of office environment, involve working with mental capacity more than with your hands, and then often require a decent amount of training and have a decent amount of prestige with them as well. So 4-year college degree kind of jobs. Pink collar jobs are jobs that have traditionally been held by who? By women. And remember we looked at some of those stats where it said which jobs are dominated by females. And the highest one I believe was kindergarten teacher or preschool teacher. And then some of the other ones were like administrative assistant, nurse, dental hygienist, and so on. So those are pink collar jobs. And then a blue collar job is a job that involves a lot of manual labor, some type of skill trade. So if you've heard the term CTE education lately, that's kind of a buzzword, career and technical education, that's blue collar. And those jobs traditionally have been held by who? Males. Yep, go ahead.
So can like a white collar job be a pink collar job and a blue collar?
Yeah, yep. Nurse practitioner, that was like 96% female. So that would be both a pink collar and a white collar job.
But wouldn't like dental hygienist be like both? Or-
Maybe, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, dental hygienist, that's a decent job. It's a, what is it, a 2.5-year program? Anybody look into that? Yeah, you are, that's right, yep. 2.5?
It's 2
'Cause-
years.
2 years plus an internship?
No, there's
I don't know about-
yeah.
Okay.
You just go for a year to get your generals and then 2 years for the program.
Okay. And then
So 3 years.
in town here, I think dental hygienists start at like 55, 60. And then you work Monday through
Thursday.
Thursday typically.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and you start at 55, 60 grand a year, but you gotta dig in
You're the
people's
one
mouths
who
all
has to
day.
do the dirty
That's
deeds.
awesome.
Yeah.
So you get that. In your face.
Yeah, so,
The dentists
I-
are the one with the.
I don't know, probably I'd put it, Morgan, I'm not gonna put a question that's that, like, debatable in there,
Okay.
okay? Yep. So be able to identify if you see a list like, Susie is going to school to be a nurse, which of the following statements is true? And then it describes white collar, pink collar, whatever, you gotta pick out which one fits. What do SI theorists say about stratification?
It has to do with perception.
Has to do with perception, so it's not necessarily about being wealthy, prestigious, whatever. I should just turn this off. It's about the perception of being wealthy. So I mentioned the phrase keeping up with the Joneses. Remember the discussion on that? There's stories of people that will, when they go back to their 10-year reunion, they'll rent a car that's better than what they have normally to make people think that they're doing better than they really are. The phrase that the text talked about was this idea of conspicuous consumption. Remember that? So that's like you have to have the AirPods. That tells you how uncool I am with that. But you have to have those because those are the cool ones. So if like a kid, let's say a high school kid, gets a Christmas present, it's like the generic ones of those. They're like, this is garbage, this is trash. They wouldn't want it. So the idea I mentioned was the Beats headphones versus like the generic kind. That I should find a picture of that and take it and show it. But they have a page in the Consumer Reports and it's like, here's the price of the Beats ones, here's the price of the ones from Monoprice. Monoprice ones, battery life is better. People rated them as fitting better when they didn't know what brand they were, right? They were able to reproduce sound ranges, decibel ranges that were different, bass was better, all that. Monoprice ones are a quarter of the price. But nobody wants those, they want the Beats ones because of that idea of conspicuous consumption. Because what you wear or the car you drive or the brand carries a message that shows that I'm more important. So that's a SI analysis of it.
You should go check who that is.
It's me, You know what it probably is? I just put in a security system. So
Like
it's,
a hiring.
huh?
I thought you were hiring.
Well, I added a camera. I,
Where?
The hallway of his house.
Yeah.
Everyone's
So,
living room.
yeah,
Every time there's motion.
well, no, I told you that, my daughter is notorious for being late. Did I tell you the story? And then, so I watched, the thing went off one day, and then I see her, like, you can see the bus pulling up out the window. So I see the bus pulling up, and then I see my daughter sprint out, like, because she never wants to go to bed. So then, the next day, I showed her the video of that and said, you have to go to bed now, because you're always bad about getting up in the morning. The next day, when she stepped outside, it's one of those doorbell cameras. She stepped outside, here's the doorbell, she goes, and then turned around and walked away. So she wasn't too happy. That's what you would do?
Oh, yeah.
So we talked about social mobility. What's the term for if society as a whole moves up or down? Instead of just an individual, like society improves a lot. That's called structural social mobility.
Okay.
What does marriage do to mobility levels? Yeah, so married people are healthier, their social class is higher. You get divorced, what happens? It goes down quite a bit. What's the difference between absolute and relative poverty?
Absolute poverty is where like your life is being threatened by it, and relative poverty is like you can survive, but you don't have all the luxuries that you would have
Yep.
if you weren't.
Absolute poverty is life-threatening. So again, there might be, I've got a whole bunch of different questions I use, but one in the past I would use is something like, which of the following people is more likely to experience absolute poverty? And then I say like a college student in the United States, and then I say like a 4-year-old in West Africa, and then a 25-year-old in Europe that just lost his job or whatever. And the answer is the West African kid. Okay, so relative poverty is the type of poverty that people experience when they don't have as much as other people. Maybe they're like a little worried about money. But like they're not gonna die. Absolute poverty is like you need food, you need medical attention. So be able to identify that in different things. Okay, in the past, when we talked about global stratification, they talked about first world, second world, and third world countries.
Yeah.
Now they talk about high income, middle income, and low income countries.
Yes.
So let's start with the old terminology. What was first world, second world, third world? What did that mean?
Human Development Index.
Yeah, that's tied to it, but
Well, wasn't it used around the Cold War?
yeah. So define them.
So first world was essentially the allies of the U.S., right?
Yeah, NATO countries pretty much.
Yeah.
Yep. Second world.
The Russian countries?
Yep.
And then-
Communist, Eastern European states.
Yep.
Yep. And then third world was.
The ones that didn't really have an affiliation?
Well, third world was like African nations.
Yeah.
So the poor nations that hadn't industrialized yet at all.
Are we getting to know that?
Maybe one question about that, the idea of first, second, third world. So now they use the term high income, middle, and low, and they don't consider like communism, capitalism. What's the thing that matters in that variable?
Like GDP?
Yep, per capita GDP. So if it's, I don't remember the exact cutoff. I don't really care if you guys know the exact cutoff. I think it's 15 grand and higher is high income nations. And that's the average salary of a worker per year. And then 14,999 to like 5 grand is middle income, and then low income is below. So there are a few questions where it says, which of these lists contains countries that are all high income nations? So it's not like you have to like know every single country in the world that's high income,
Yeah.
but you should have an idea. So where are most high income countries located?
Europe?
Europe and North America. You have a couple sprinkled in Asia, Middle East because of oil, and so on. Where are most middle income nations located?
South.
South America, Asia, some in Africa, and then most low-income nations are
Middle East and Africa. Well, yeah.
Asia and Africa, correct. So again, be able to identify some of those. We talked about slavery and different types of that. Remember I wrote that on the board one day? What's the, it traditionally was called chattel slavery, where like one person is owned by another person. Now they call that, remember I wrote on the board, that's called descent-based slavery. So that's where the reason you're a slave is because, you know, African Americans were slaves, to use the US example. And then if you own a slave and then that slave has a child, then that child is your slave also. So that's called descent-based slavery. Again, in the past they used to call it chattel-based slavery. Now they have what's called forced labor imposed by the state also. So that's what's going on in like northwestern China with the Uyghurs. In various places, it's like you have to work for the government because they want you to. There's also child slavery, where children are forced to work for people and they don't really want to. Debt bondage. Debt bondage is where you can't afford to pay your bills, so you have to go through and check that out. This is all on slide 18 of the notes if you download the notes for this chapter. And then the last type, the one that gets talked about quite a bit in the States now, is human trafficking, exactly. And that's where people are brought around for the purpose of a variety of different things, but usually by an organized crime group. So there's an organization to bring in kids for prostitution or whatever. So again, be able to identify a few of those. You'll hear a scenario like Susie is in a forced marriage. What type of slavery would this be? Forced marriage is type of one. I'd phrase it a little different than that.
Which one would that would be?
They usually just call it forced marriage or forced. So it's not forced labor imposed by the state. It's called a servile form of marriage is the technical term for that. Yeah. Yeah. So on the slide, I'm looking at the slide right now. It says 6 types of slavery: descent-based slavery, forced labor, child slavery, debt bondage, servile marriage, and then human trafficking.
What is it on?
It's slide 18 of the notes if you download them from the chapter on global stratification. So here's an example. In a lot of societies, polygamy is acceptable. So you can be married to multiple spouses. Almost always in polygamy, it's a guy with multiple wives, right? So there might be like a fairly rich guy that's got 2 wives, and he's like 45. And I think in Iran, if you're female, you have to be 9 years old and then you can get married legally. So what'll happen in many countries is somebody will be 40, 45 years old, they'll have a decent amount of money, they'll have, let's say, 2 or 3 wives. They decide they want another wife, they'll find somebody that's 17, 18, and then marry them, and then that person really doesn't have a lot of choice, because their family might have kind of sold them to the person or forced them to marry them or something. So that's pretty common in a lot of countries. Again, especially in Asia and Africa. Okay, let's talk about modernization and dependency theory and give some examples. So what's going to happen, there you'll have a few examples where it describes historical situations, and then it asks you which scenario best matches modernization or dependency theory. So modernization and dependency theory, remember, are theories that seek to explain why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. So, or it seeks to explain the causes of global stratification. So, modernization aligns more with which overall theory? More with functionalism. And it's not completely clean like that, but yes, more with functionalism. Dependency theory aligns more with conflict theory. So let me give you some scenarios and then I want you to identify which one fits more. So if you're talking about, like, some countries, they believe that when you mine, so when you go in a mine, you're underground mining, you can't wear shoes while you're mining because if you wear shoes, it's believed to be like, it'll anger the spirits. It's like cultural beliefs. Is that modernization or dependency theory?
Modernization.
Modernization, because it doesn't just involve technology, it also involves cultural beliefs. So, take a mine and let's say you have 100 workers in one mine and you have 100 workers in another, and they have equal technology, they're the same age, physically in the same shape, all that stuff. One group is in a country where they believe you can't wear shoes underground because it's going to bring curses on them, and another group you can wear boots underground. Which one's going to have less injuries and be able to more effectively be a miner? The one that wears the boots, right? So they haven't adopted new or modern cultural beliefs, and that makes it so they don't produce as much. You could use like Afghanistan for an example. Afghanistan, a lot of places, girls don't go to school. Girls try to go to school, they'll get acid thrown in their face. The famous case of Malala, right, where she got shot for trying to go to school. So they have a cultural belief that says women shouldn't learn. So from the start, you have half of your population that's just not involved in discovering new things or learning how to be an engineer or whatever, right? You have half your population that's not going to school. You're not going to be as productive then because of that. Also the technology piece, that's modernization theory as well. So what are some statements or examples of how dependency theory would apply?
How we should do it.
Countries,
Other countries.
giving them a bad deal. So
Yeah, giving them a bad deal. So traditionally you have traded with one country and you exert a lot of influence over that country and say, we still want the same trade deal. And you're like the country that's in charge of some treaty group, whatever. The other country, the one that doesn't have as much power, is kind of stuck selling to you, even though what they sell you is worth way, way more. So that's dependency theory. You could argue like refusing to share technology, even though it's technology, but that, if the reason they're not getting technology is because rich countries are like, we're not going to share it with you, that's dependency theory. So dependency theory basically is when one country relies on another country, they're dependent on them, and there's an unfair relationship in that situation. That's pretty good. All right, let's move on to chapter 11. Chapter 11 is on gender stratification. So make sure you know the difference between some of the terms we talked about before, such as sex and gender, such as gender stratification, primary and secondary sex characteristics, and all that. If you're in a society where men control things, they make all the decisions, what type of society is that?
Patriarchy.
That's a patriarchy. If it's women,
Matriarchy.
matriarchy. What if you hold a belief that one sex is innately superior than another? That's called sexism. Yep. What are the expected behaviors tied to gender called? No. Remember, you have a social position, that's called a status. And then what are the behaviors called? Roles, yep. So it's gender roles specifically. Okay, give me some examples of occupations. So just for context, this would be slide 24 in the PowerPoint notes you can download for chapter 11. What are some examples of occupations that have the highest concentrations of women?
Nursing, preschool teachers, people work.
Yep. So let me give you you know how I asked you to explain scenarios, right?
Yeah.
So conflict theorists would say that the reason that women are employed in occupations such as these is because why?
Oppression.
Yep, so the system pushes them in that direction because those jobs often aren't as prestigious and often don't pay as much money. Now, what would an exchange theory analysis of that say?
Exchange theory? Well,
Why are there way more women that are dental assistants? That's number 7. Dental hygienist is number 3 on this list. Hairdresser is number 9. What would exchange theorists say?
They think the trade-off of the money is worth it compared to the job.
Yeah, so exchange is a micro level analysis. So exchange theorists would say that the reason there's so many more preschool teachers that are female is because on average women are choosing, they're weighing the pros and cons, and they're choosing to be involved in that more than males are. So conflict theorists are like, it's racism or sexism in this instance. Exchange theorists are saying individuals are choosing and that's building it. Okay, what would functionalists say?
They'd say it's based on choice. Well,
To some degree. They would say that
they're naturally drawn.
people are drawn to positions that will help society to function more, right? So it's better that we have way more preschool and kindergarten teachers that are females than males because it helps society to function better. So like at wrestling practice last night, my son starts crying. He's like, I don't want to wrestle that guy. I'm like, stand up, you wrestle him, you know? So, and there are times where you know, you can be kind, nurturing, whatever, but in that moment I'm like, suck it up, buddy, like, let's go, you know? So if you have a whole bunch of guys employed as preschool teachers, and again, talking about the biological differences between men and women tend to be more interested in people, men tend to be more interested in things. It makes sense, a functionalist argument would say, to have more women in those things, because they're just generally going to be better for it. What's the gender pay gap? Well, yeah, it's roughly 80 cents, but what is it? The value of it is 80 cents, but what is it? Yeah, go for it.
Men
Yep.
make more money than women on average.
Men make more money than women on average. Same thing before, like be able to say what would conflict theorists say, what would functionalists say, and all that. You can go up here. Yeah. You talk to me about it ahead of time.
Functionalists would probably say
Okay. What is the theory that says that race, gender, class, all those things interact to give levels of disadvantagedness that's greater? Intersection theory, yep. Intersectional theory is super woke. Like we talked about that today. Intersection or intersectional theory, yes. Okay, last thing we'll talk about for this chapter is the 3 types of feminism. What were the 3 types of feminism?
socialist, liberal, radical.
Socialist, liberal, and radical. Liberal feminists say that they want to just change things a little bit in society. You guys gotta leave or what?
I have to go. My mom will get mad at me if I don't be there by 3:45.
My mom will be mad at me.
She will. So I have to leave or else I...
Okay, you're missing the last chapter, so
Yeah.
that's fine. Oh, you know what I forgot to do is pass out a sign-in sheet. Let's do that real quick. They were never here. Write down unit 3 on the top and then pass it around. Okay, so liberal feminists think that the way society is right now generally is okay, the general structure. Let's not try to abolish the family. Let's not try to have gender-neutral bathrooms. Let's just pass policies or tweak laws to try and make things a little bit better. Socialist feminists believe that the root cause of the problem is the capitalist system. So we have to get rid of capitalism in order for men and women to have equality. And then radical feminists believe that we should just collectively work to eliminate the concept of gender itself. Like, we shouldn't consider gender at all in anything. That's radical. Whoever gets the sheet at the end, bring it up to me and then I'll write down their names on it so I remember also. Okay, let's move on to the last chapter, chapter 12, which is on race and ethnicity. So again, be able to identify the distinction between race and ethnicity. So race is the socially constructed category of people who share biologically similar characteristics that society deems as important. So, and often that's based on melanin levels, right? Skin color, which is determined by the amount of melanin you have. When we're talking about the term minority, minority is not just statistics, or I should say not necessarily statistics. What is it based on?
Power.
It's based on power. So the example I give often is the British in India. There's like 1,000 Indians for one British person in the 1800s when Britain was a colony of India, but the British people were in control. So again, minority in the sociological sense is not just statistics, it's about power. What's the difference between prejudice and discrimination?
Prejudice is like thoughts and discrimination is actions.
Yep. Prejudice is unfair thoughts and beliefs. Discrimination is actions. We didn't talk about this, but it's one of the terms. What is stereotype then?
Exaggerated description applied to every person in some category.
Yeah, so in short, prejudicial beliefs are negative, so whereas stereotypes can be positive. So have you heard people say, like, here's an example of a stereotype. Asians are good at math. Have you heard that before?
Blondes are dumb.
Okay, blondes are dumb. What? White guys like what? White guys from North Dakota like what? Like what?
I said dip.
Oh, chew?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, dip, country music, and Chevy trucks or whatever. So those would be stereotypes. You can believe that about somebody and not be prejudiced about them. Do you see the difference between prejudice and stereotype? Okay, so be able to identify those things as well. Monday, we'll talk about something called the Bogardus Social Distance Research Scale. So I don't want to explain all that now, but we'll talk about it a little bit again on Monday. So that's the Bogardus Social Distance Research Scale is a measure of prejudice and discrimination, basically. It's a way to try to explain it. The other thing we'll talk about on Monday is called theories of prejudice. Again, I don't want to explain the whole thing now because you haven't even been exposed to it, and given the time, that wouldn't be a good use of time, I believe. But the theories of prejudice, this would be slides 16 and 17. If you're a person that downloads the notes, that would be scapegoat theory, authoritarian personality theory, culture theory, and conflict theory. So, again, if you pay attention on Monday, you'll understand that in more detail. It's basically trying to say, where does prejudice come from? What's the difference between discrimination and institutional discrimination? Mason, you want to shut the door? Thank you. What's the difference between discrimination and institutional discrimination? It's built within the structure of the business or society or whatever. Whereas discrimination is just broadly the unfair treatment. So if you yourself are prejudiced and you act unfairly against people, you are discriminating against them. But if you're the only person in the company and there's no policies and there's no pattern, it's not institutional discrimination. Do you see the difference? Okay, so then be aware of terms like pluralism, assimilation, genocide, segregation.
These are on Revel, right?
Yes.
Yeah, all of them are on Rev.
Okay.
Yep. And then the last thing we'll talk about also is something called affirmative action. Have you heard of affirmative action in government class or anything? Okay, so Morgan or Ethan, you were nodding. Do you want to describe what affirmative action is?
It's like a system set in place to kind of like help minorities or like give them an advantage in some way to make up for
to make up for mistreatment in the past, or to encourage, or current discrimination, but also to encourage diversity. That's part of the logic too. So, the assumption behind that is that, you know, a black male or female will bring something to the table that a white person couldn't. So, affirmative action is policies and procedures put in place, and often in schools, but also in businesses, that are built in to encourage diversity in order to correct discrimination, past or present, or to encourage diversity. So those are pretty controversial policies, but. So that's the test in a nutshell. I'm gonna give people a chance to ask any questions if you want. Again, a lot of the things are gonna be scenarios where it's gonna say something like, Johnny did this, what's that an example of? And I tried to emphasize those today. Any questions? No questions? Okay. All right, have a good weekend. Mason, when you go, can you prop the door open for us, please? And then, I know a few people had questions about take-home essays. I can answer those too.